This is Tommy's Outdoors 138. And in this episode of the podcast, you will hear voices of marine mammals, seals and whales. And the reason for that is that today we are going to talk about marine acoustic ecology. Who would have thought that there is a discipline like marine acoustic ecology? And our guest is Dr. Denise Risch, who is specializing in marine acoustic ecology with a special focus on acoustic behavior of marine mammals. Folks, I just felt like I discovered a whole new world while talking to Denise in this episode of the podcast. And Denise is one of the scientists from the Compass Project, and today's episode is the last episode where we cover the research conducted as a part of the Compass Project. And anyone interested in the Compass Project itself, I invite you to go back and listen to other episodes dedicated to research done as a part of it. And those of you who follow me on social media, especially on Twitter, but also on Instagram and Facebooky and TikTok, I think that social media at this time is perhaps not the most reliable way to stay in touch. And so all of you who wants to stay in touch, not only with the podcast, but also other stuff that's going on with Tommy's Outdoors, I invite you to subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description of the show, and I always advise you to go to the description of the show because there's a lot of links in there. Get in there and subscribe to Tommy's Outdoors newsletter, newsletter.tommysoutdoors.com. And that way we can stay in touch. You can always reply to one of the emails that you're getting, and that email gets straight to my inbox. So that's a additional value of you being able to contact me and ask questions if you have, or suggest guests and so on and so forth. But also I can keep you updated with the latest developments related to Tommy's Outdoors, conservation, ecology, and so on and so on. So get in there, subscribe to Tommy's Outdoors newsletter, newsletter.tommysoutdoors.com. And now, without any further delay, Denise Risch and acoustic behavior of marine mammals. Denise, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yes, it's a pleasure. And we're going to talk about marine mammals and aquatic soundscapes. When I was reading to this episode, I found this term aquatic soundscapes. It sounds fantastic. Can you explain what are the aquatic soundscapes?
What are the aquatic soundscapes? So if we talk about soundscape, basically what we are trying to capture with that word is everything that makes sounds in the ocean. And it's typically split into three sort of categories. That's how we usually talk about aquatic soundscapes. So we've got the animals that make sounds, and that's a large part of what I'm studying and how I got into this field, and we can talk about that more. So there's marine mammals, but all a lot of species, not just whales and dolphins, that we typically think of making sounds, produce. There are other species that also produce sounds in the ocean, like fish, and a lot of invertebrate species even produce sounds, even though we don't necessarily think of them immediately when we think about underwater sounds, just because they're so much quieter, and so we haven't recorded them in for a long time.
Wow!
Before we had better microphones, yeah, and then we've got sounds that are made by the environment. So if it rains, if there's earthquakes, if we've got thunder coming through, all of that is heard underwater, and so that's what we call the geophony, or all the ambient sound, and then of course there's us as well producing underwater noise and or sounds, and that's what we are also working on here in my lab. So we of course use a lot of big ships or smaller ships. They all produce sounds with their propellers. We are conducting seismic surveys to find oil and gas. We build offshore wind farms. All of these things are creating sounds in the ocean, and those are at noise for the animals and can impact them. And so that's all of those things together is what we mean when we talk about aquatic soundscapes.
Yeah, this is like most people, when they think about the ocean, they don't think about sounds underwater. But then when you think about it, it's kind of logical that there are sounds. So
Yeah, it's
just like
actually something. Just to, I often start my talks that way. I think that the reason why a lot of us don't think about sounds underwater is goes back to Jacques Cousteau, who made this movie, the Silent World, in the 60s. That's, I think, created this impression in our head that just because we can't hear so well underwater, that there's nothing to be heard underwater. But that's we now know is far from the truth, and it's rather the opposite. The ocean is full of sound.
you could be right that these cultural things that people don't even realize, but they're kind of like in the culture, gets passed through. It's like, oh, a silent world, I guess. But we cannot hear those sounds because our hearing apparatus is not built to receive those sounds underwater. Or are they
Exactly.
like in a different frequencies and we cannot hear them?
It's both. So we can only hear in a certain frequency range. So as humans, we can hear between 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz. And so that means that we don't hear the very low frequencies, which blue whales and fin whales, for example, they produce sounds that are below our hearing. They're so low frequencies. Elephants on land do the same. They communicate with very low frequencies. And so it took us quite a while to figure out how elephants, for example, coordinate their movements, and only with specialized equipment were we able to say, oh, it's sound, but it's too low for us to hear. And the same happens in the ocean. And then there are the higher frequencies that porpoises and some dolphins use that are above our hearing. They are very, very high frequencies, so we can't hear it. But yeah, you're right. Our hearing is also not adapted to hear very well underwater, and that's why without specialized equipment like underwater microphones, which we call hydrophones, we can't really hear that well underwater.
Wow. So when you're then analyzing those signals, are you basically relying on like a graphical representation of what's going on, or are you kind of like shifting these frequencies towards the spectrum or towards the range of frequencies that are audible for humans?
Also both, and you're completely right. Actually, with what you suggested first, we are, because for us the visual sense is so much more important. We are so much better with our vision than with our hearing. We typically transform the sounds into something that we call spectrograms. So it's just a visual representation of time versus frequency. So we, from the low frequencies to the high frequencies, and then we color the picture with how loud the different sounds are, and that's what we use to analyze sounds. We also listen to them, but we are often better in picking out patterns using our vision than our hearing. Depends on the person, of course, as well. But yeah, a lot of the sound analysis is actually done with our eyes, which is kind of ironic.
I get it, because when I edit those podcasts, that like the amount of time I'm switching to this spectral frequency view, and then I can see all the things like, oh, I need to cut this out when someone sneezes or something.
So it's a lot easier than to listen to it. It's also faster. We can scroll through a spectrogram much faster than we can listen in real time.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow, this is fascinating. And what you said at the beginning is that there are human generated or human originated sounds as well. So is the sound pollution equally a thing in underwater? Is it to what degree this is concerning from the perspective of wildlife and conservation?
It is a big concern because it comes on top of a lot of other stressors, of course, that populations of marine mammals, for example, but also other species have to deal with. So as I said, for us, vision is the main sense. For most species, most marine species, sound is one of the main sense because you lose the light in the upper water column. So it goes down to 10, 20, 30 meters, and then it's completely dark. So they are really reliant on using sound for communicating with one another, stay in touch, find their prey. Anything they do to navigate, they use sound for doing that. So if you produce a lot of noise in the same frequency range that can mask these signals, for example, then you're impacting the range over which animals can socialize and they can pass information. So there's this, you're basically impacting their whole life and the way they're moving around. So yeah, it can have a big impact.
I heard recently the discussion about the potential impact of the military sonar on whales, and there was I think it was last year, like a massive stranding event of quite rare whales. I think they were like beaked whales or something like that, and they there was like a massive stranding in Ireland and then the Faroes and somewhere else, and then it's like, all right, there was like some military sonar exercises or something like that. And obviously I know that you as a scientist and many scientists, they kind of like a very reserved in talking about it, because like, oh, we know we know the accusing, but that's a possibility. But then where I spoke with people from NGOs, and they were like just adamant, like, yeah, that's what's going on, and we basically using this to highlight the problem because we knew about it going on for a long time.
Yeah, that's not really a scientific debate anymore. There is a clear link between these strandings of particularly beaked whales, as you said. They're very deep diving species. We know very little about them. Actually, the last few species have been discovered over the last 10 years. So
Wow.
they live in very deep ocean habitats, and so we don't often come across them. And there's likely some species out there that haven't even been described yet by science. So these are big whales. They are 7 to 10 meters long, but because they're not coastally distributed, we don't know much about them. And they really came to our attention in relation to these strandings, which we could, in some cases, link directly to military activity in the area where it happened. We are not completely certain about some of the links, but what we do know is that the way they behave when they are exposed to loud sonar leads to something similar to decompression sickness in these whales, when they basically shoot up too quickly to the surface, because they go down to 3,000 meters and more to hunt. And so if they come up too quickly, that can lead to all sorts of physiological problems, and then they might die from it. And so the strandings that you were talking about were in 2018. There was the largest mass strandings of these
I thought it was
whales
last
globally.
year. Like
Yeah. Well, the pandemic
2018.
took 2 years away, didn't it? Yeah, no, it was 2018 already. And as you said, the stranding started in Ireland and moved up the coast to the west coast of Scotland, and we found over 100 animals. There were also concurrent strandings in Iceland and the Faroe Islands at the time, and we didn't have much information about whether there was a military exercise of some sort happening at the time, but we did some hydrographic modeling of where those carcasses could have come from, and based on the the decomposition of the animals that were found on the different beaches, and the timeline of the strandings, starting in Ireland and going up to Scotland, we assume that the source for these animals to die was somewhere out in the west of Ireland, basically in the deep waters there. But what actually happened has never been confirmed. The military did say that they were in the area at the time, but that's all we know.
I was going to say that some of those exercises are just confidential, or not the wrong word, but basically nobody knows they're
classified.
Classified. That's the word I was looking for. Exactly. Thank you. That's it was described to me as if someone was shining like a super bright light in the eyes, and it's like, you can go blind. And so if someone would shine such a bright light in your eyes, you would run from that light, and you may be hit by a car or drop off the cliff, or something happens to you. And this is how it was explained to me what happened to those whales, except, like you said, this is in the sound. They probably just run from this sound, which is...
Yeah, it's probably a good analogy. It's just they're showing an extreme behavior. We don't know why especially that species group is so particularly sensitive to sound, but they are very very deep divers, as I said. So and they have a long way to come up to the surface. So it has something to do with those extreme behaviors and them being particularly vulnerable.
One other question I have, which is like, I watched a video long ago where someone was diving with the sperm whales, and those sperm whales were clicking, and the guy was saying that this sperm whale can click you to death with the sounds. Is that true, or was it just not true?
I would highly doubt that. Yeah, those are they're powerful clicks. They have a lot of energy, and they. They use it to get a lot of information about their surroundings, to detect prey over long ranges and so on. So they put a lot of energy in there, but I doubt that you could die from.
He said, like, our bodies were heating up, and the sperm whale came. It's probably for a YouTube video. But I just, like, since I've
heard that it's an interesting experience to be clicked on by a whale. I've heard people describe that. I haven't had that experience myself, but yeah, I've never.
What did they say? That it all goes through the body like a wave?
Yeah, that you just can feel it. You're just being scanned, by those animals. So yeah, and they obviously can look inside of you. So it's kind of interesting to think about how they perceive the world and how different it is, from
because the
what
sound goes right through. So they kind of like an X-ray.
They can detect. Yeah, it's like an X-ray. They would know if you were pregnant. If I was pregnant. So yeah.
Wow, that's very interesting. How did you get into that? How did you start? Figure out this moment. When was this moment? Say, like, yeah, this is fantastic. I just want to, dedicate my career to that.
For me, I'm one of those people that was interested in marine mammals from childhood, actually. And I grew up in Berlin, so I grew up in a big city far away from the ocean. But I attribute my love for the ocean and my interest in marine mammals actually to Jacques Cousteau and his documentaries, which I remember watching with my family as a child. But the reason why got interested in underwater acoustics is because of an internship that I did right after high school. I got the fantastic opportunity to go up to British Columbia in Canada and to study orcas and their natural habitat up there. Near Vancouver Island, and this group of researchers called Orca Lab. They are based on a remote island north of Vancouver Island, and they have installed a network of underwater microphones or hydrophones around their island, and so they are tracking when those whales are coming into their area. They are not on the water; they are completely, they're not interfering with the whales, but they, by just listening to the different orca families come in and out of their core area, they've learned so much. They've been doing this over the last 30 years, and so this experience of sitting on shore and tracking those whales moving through the area at night and during daytime, and listening in on what they were doing when different groups were meeting, that just got me hooked, and then that was it. That's how I started.
Wow. So there was this. Are you mainly focusing on the whales, on the like a dolphins, and are you also on the mammals like seals and?
I did actually. For my master's research, I worked on birded seals, which are an Arctic seal species. The males produce these beautiful trills. I can send on some recordings maybe
Please,
afterwards if you
that would
want. Then you can put them in.
For sure.
And because those sounds, I want everyone to hear them, because I think they're fascinating, and I don't think people usually think that seals could make these sounds. Anyway, the male seals are producing these elaborate vocal displays to woo the females. And so I was studying those for my master's research. And so I've studied several species. We are also studying fish sounds now, and as I said, we are also working a lot on underwater noise that humans make nowadays. So.
I feel like we're like I feel like I'm discovering the whole world that neither I or our listeners knew about it. Like how many aspects of it is like. While we on the just on the theme of human made or generated sounds, what's the story with the offshore wind generation? Is that because they're like, the last time I heard is like, oh, the impacts are unknown, but perhaps it will impact plankton. Perhaps you like where this situation is right now.
So from just looking at underwater noise from offshore wind, there's different phases, right? So if you build the wind farm, you're producing a lot of noise because you're typically piling the big turbines into the ground, and that can be quite noisy. Sometimes in the North Sea, for example, we have a lot of old munitions that are still in some areas where offshore wind farms are going to be built. So those need to be exploded before they put something there. So again, that creates a lot of noise. So that whole construction phase of offshore wind, that's from a noise perspective the most harmful potentially to marine mammals that are in the area. There's ways to mitigating the noise, and that those are being applied to different extents in different countries. And then during the operational phase, a single turbine is not that much above ambient sound, so the natural sounds that you would record. But if you put out big arrays as we do now, so 100, 200 turbines or whatever, then the noise just from the turbines operating is a bit louder and raises the noise levels a little bit in that area, but not really to a level where it's of concern to in terms of hearing damage, but it might modulate the behavior of animals. So that's an area of active research. It might also have positive benefits. It might attract certain species to come to the turbines, including invertebrates, larvae that might settle more readily when they hear that noise. So those things are still being researched there. But in terms of impact on marine mammal species, for example, but also fish and invertebrates, is that we have to look at the construction phase for that.
Gotcha. That makes sense, because that's where, like you said, the putting those pylon in and all sorts of stuff. Okay, listen, we should probably mention Compass Project, because this is like a big theme. This is why we're here. But I just don't want to like drive straight into the Compass Project. I will lead with a question, like, how do you like, you mentioned those hydrophones and other things. So what is the equipment, how the process looks like of gathering data? Because I presume, like in most of these cases, you first gather a lot of data and then you analyze and do all these things. So how the gathering stage looks like? What is the equipment used for that?
So there's a whole lot of equipment that we are using, different ones. In terms of the Compass project, our aim there was to really go out for a long time period. So we were collecting data over 5 years. So we and of course we can't go out every 2 weeks. That's just way too expensive. Hiring and getting a big ship together to go out anywhere in the ocean really costs a lot of money. So we use these autonomous recorders. They're quite small. I actually have one here. Because I'm just downloading some data at the moment, I can show you. So they're tiny. So they have really come a long way.
So is this floating, like you with this
no,
antenna?
So this is what actually sit like this in the water column. So it's called a sound trap. So we've got a hydrophone up here. So that's the recording device. And then there's a little tiny computer and some batteries inside of this little thing. And so that's attached to a rope. And then that's attached to a big weight and what we call an acoustic release. So we can bring everything back to the surface by playing a sound to that acoustic release mechanism. So
you're also controlling that through this, because it has a microphone. You can play the sound.
It has a microphone. It can hear us, and if we send a certain sequence of sounds, it says, "Oh, yeah, I'm supposed to come back up." So it opens a mechanical mechanism, and the whole thing comes up to the surface. And so we are able to also retrieve the weight, which is amazing.
I guess these are smart animal figured it out. Like if I make this sound, this thing goes up. Probably not possible, but it's just fun thing to.
That's actually something I've never thought about, but I wouldn't. That would be
dolphins are very intelligent. They just go with like, and
we do sometimes lose them. We usually lose them to trawling, but
okay, gotcha.
Who knows?
And by the way, this is good opportunity to put people who are listening to that to go to YouTube channel and just look at this hydrophone that Denise showed us. Just a friendly reminder for people who are only on audio version of this podcast. Also go to YouTube. You can see some cool stuff. Okay, so that was the goal of Compass project, of that piece of work, just to gather all that data on a long period of time, or did you have like some other objectives of it?
Yeah, so our objective was to record. So the Compass project is based, or was a big collaboration between Northern Irish, and Scottish partners. It was funded by the EU Interact program, and it enabled us to, with all of us together, to put out uh, 10 to 15 of these recorders at a time, and into an area where we didn't have much information about marine mammal distribution and how many they are at different times of years. And so we really wanted to learn more, particularly in the winter, of what marine mammals particularly, but also other species. As I said, fish, we can track cod and haddock with these devices as well, because they also produce sounds. So it was really to gain a better understanding on when we record these species and where the hotspots, where the area that we need to look into a little bit closer when we are planning offshore wind parks, and which area do we need to put marine protected areas in order to give species that come into our waters more protection from things like fishing, or risk of entanglement is a big one for a lot of the large whale species, things like that. So it's really to better understand their life cycle. When are they here? What are we missing in the wintertime, particularly because we are not out on the water? There's few of us who are sailing around the west coast of Scotland in the winter. It's a pretty remote place. We do know a lot more in the summertime. So that was the aim of the project.
Okay, to focus on the winter time. And how many, like, what because I presume this is like a network of those hydrophones. And
Yeah, so we had between 10 to 12 devices out at the time. So they were stretching from the northern tip of the Outer Hebrides to the north coast of Ireland, so Northern Irish and North Irish waters.
is it 10 to 12?
Where we deployed.
I thought that you're going to
So
say
it was a fairly sparse array, because these, they are small devices, but they're not cheap. They're about 5,000 pounds.
Wow.
Not quite sure what that's in euro at the moment, but and then the whole mooring together is costs quite a bit of money. So that kind of usually restricts how many of them we can put out.
And what is the area that is covered by that one device?
That depends. So that's an interesting question. So because it depends on what you're listening for. So if you are listening for fin whales, for example, who are producing these really low frequency sounds, and if you're in deep waters, we can detect them over many miles, and so the range would be tens. To hundreds of kilometers if the conditions are right.
Wow.
If you're listening to something like a harbour porpoise, a really small dolphin-like species that we see a lot around the Irish and UK coasts, they produce these really high frequency clicks that I've talked about in the beginning, and the range for those are in the hundreds of meters. So it depends on what you're listening for, what sounds the animals make, as to what the range is over which you're listening. And the same goes for underwater noise that humans produce. So the low frequency sounds of big ships or seismic surveys, we can pick them up over hundreds of miles, and that's why they are so problematic, because they travel over such long ranges in deep waters particularly, and as compared to very high frequency echo sounders, for examples, that range over lesser ranges. So it depends what you're listening for.
And how did you pick the points where they're like in standard points for all 5 years, or where you were moving them around a little bit to change the coverage? How did that was designed?
Yeah, we actually had a big workshop before we started to figure out where do we place them, and there's a lot of things that you need to consider. You of course first you have to think about, okay, which species am I most interested in, which what do I want to know about them, where are the areas where I have gaps because no one has looked there before. So those all play a role, but then things that also play a role in determining where we put them in the end was where the fishermen, where are they trawling the most, because if you put them down in an area where there's a lot of trawling, then they won't be out there for very long. So we were trying to avoid areas with a lot of fishing pressure, and or to go too close to ferry crossings and so on. So yeah, the placement was driven both by where the data gaps were, but also where they were relatively safe, so that we didn't have to go and chase them every 2 weeks. Yeah, so we put them out, just to give you an idea. They can record for about 4 to 5 months at a time before we go out in a big boat and collect them all and download the data and then put them back into the water again.
Okay, but you put them on back in the same place, or where do you move them after 5 months?
Yeah, we do put them in the same place, because we do want these replicates. So we want to know year after year, do we see any changes, and or do we see the same patterns every year? If something, if we collect these baseline data, then if something happens, if we get a certain climatic event, or if there's a certain disturbance event, then we have something to compare against, and we know what was there before. And so the sites stayed the same over the project.
Okay. And did you have like a, as they call it, like a species of interest? So did you focus on some particular species, or was it just we're gonna put them out there and see what we find?
The goal was, we didn't have a particular species in mind. It was to really learn about marine mammals in this region in general, and there's a lot of species that we know relatively little about. For instance, we are seeing, or we are getting reports of humpback whales in our coastal waters now, which is increasing again. They've always been in this region, but there's an apparent increase in sightings, and so we could record them on our recorders as well, and a whole range of species we were interested in.
On those humpback whales, are they moving because of a climate change, you think, or is it like some other reasons, or were it just not observed before?
I said apparent increase because we don't know exactly whether there's actually more whales, or whether they or whether there's just more people looking for them, and more people more aware of them. So we're still trying to figure that out. But it's certainly nice to see them in coastal waters of Scotland and Ireland. We are on their migration route, so they're coming up from the Caribbean or the Cape Verde Islands, and they move up to Iceland and Norway to feed in the summer, and we are a bit of a migration stopover for them. And so they produce these beautiful songs that people might have heard of. If you hear whale sounds on TV, it's often a humpback whale, because their sounds are just so well known, and that's what we typically think about. What a whale sounds like. Yeah,
that's pretty cool. And so once you gather that data, once you gather all those recordings, what were the next steps? How did you I read that you were using some advanced machine learning techniques. You're using convolutional neural networks and stuff like that. Can you walk us a little bit? It's like personally very interesting to me, because I work with machine learning in my day job. So if you can just give some geeky stuff.
Yeah, well, you probably know more than I do about it, because we are just, or I personally am just getting into all of this. So the reason for going to machine learning is just because of the sheer volume of data. As you can imagine, if you're going out with 10 recorders for 5 years continuously, recording from over a broad frequency range, you collect terabytes of data every year, and we need to archive all of that, which is a problem in itself. So the first step is to download the devices, the recordings. When we come back, the data is usually compressed so that we can fit more of it on the devices, and that they can stay out for longer. So we have to first decompress them so that we can create these wave files, so the sound files that we can then put into the different software.
Is this lossless compression, or is it like a standard MP3 kind of thing?
No, it's lossless compression. Yeah, because because MP3 we would lose some of the frequencies and the details. So it's lossless compression.
And what size of the files we're talking about? How much data is it? Just roughly.
I should have looked that up. It's a few. How much was it? I think we collected for one deployment, which was about 4 months at a time, and our 10 recorders, we had about 4 terabyte of data.
That's a lot of.
And that's uncompressed. So if we decompress it, then it's probably around 6 to 8 terabyte or so for one deployment, and so we had 4 deployments every year. So it does add up. Yeah. It's a lot of data.
That's for sure. That's where the machine learning. So what were you just basically training model to detect certain species, and then try to kind of put this data through the model through the inference process, and find like, okay, here's at the 30 hours 25 minutes 2 seconds there is a humpback whale, and then someone listens, and is that how it looked like?
Exactly, yeah, and we're still really working on it. It's in some ways, bioacoustics is just starting the process to really get into this world of deep learning and artificial intelligence, and it's proving so useful because traditionally we analyzed a lot of the data manually, which means that someone had to sit in front of a computer, open up the sound file, and look through hours of data, listen to it,
and listen
look
to 5 months of ocean sounds.
a lot of it, yeah. And some people love it, some people hate it. Some of my students never came back. A lot of them really love it because you always find something interesting. Yeah, it is. You need to be really patient, and it's not for everyone, for sure. But even for the ones that are keen, like me, who love listening to hours and hours of underwater sounds, we wouldn't get through all the data. It's just too much. And so we need automated detectors, and we used to have them. They've been developed over the last 50, 30 years. But machine learning is really changing the accuracy and precision of these detectors. They are just outperforming most other detectors. Not in all circumstances, but in a lot of circumstances. These new tools are really, really helpful.
You can use those detectors in a stage of training the model, I guess, and then compare whether model performs as good as the detectors, and then kind of you're reiterating to make it.
Yeah, exactly. It's an iterative process using traditional detectors, as you say, or also using humans. So we'll go through a subset of the data. We verify that what is there and ground truthing it exactly, and then we are giving it back to the model, retrain it. We give it a lot of noise because a detector that is trained in, on the west coast of Scotland, for example, where it's relatively quiet, will fall over as soon as you put it into an area where there's a lot more noise. You need to give it a lot of context. But once you've done that, then these models are just fantastic because they can be run. You put them on at night over the weekend, they do the work, you come back and you've got your output in the morning. And so, the idea is usually what we are looking for is quite broad timescales. So in an hour, which species did we detect, or during in a day, and just a tabulation of which species were there, and how that changes over the season is what we're looking for.
That's very interesting, and it's very good to know that. I see there is a more and more use of machine learning in like a scientific research, and especially like you said, we have this ability now to gather a lot of data, and this is becoming a problem to process all that data. And in those cases, this is a great help. So is there? I presume that what you already said. I think I'm just clarifying. You still actually working through that data. So in that in that term, so the Compass project officially is finished, but I guess that work will continue in respective research institutions going forward.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, we've collected a lot of data, and there's various students that are using it for different projects. We have many collaborations with colleagues from all over the world, really, that use our data for various reasons. So that's really nice and fruitful to have these collaborations. And I would say we have analyzed maybe, definitely less than 50% of the data at this point. There's so much more to be learned from it, and we are hoping also to continue at least some of the sites, because what I said earlier, the baseline, so creating these long time series, kind of like we record weather and climate conditions over. You need long time series in order to observe changes, and we kind of need the same for the presence of different species in the ocean, so that we can observe if there is a wind farm to be built in a certain area, what happens, what does it change, where do we need to apply mitigation. So we do need these baselines, and acoustics are a relatively cheap way to collect them. And so we're hoping that some of this monitoring can continue. And that's why it's so important that we build the tools that can go through the data a lot quicker than we're used to, and have.
And then also, once you have all that data, then I imagine like 5-10 years from now, some new information come to light, and it's like, oh, do we never look at this data? Just in search
exactly,
for
it's
this
surprising
thing.
how many. You wouldn't believe, I think, how many sounds we don't know about. There's so many surprises in the data where we hear something and we have no clue which species makes these sounds. For a lot of species, their sounds are not described yet, or have just recently been described. For very many sounds, we don't know the context in which the different species produce these sounds. And that's true even for the best studied whales. So humpback whales, for example, again, coming back to them and their elaborate songs that they produce. We know a lot about those songs and how they change over time, and it's fascinating, but we don't even know yet for sure why they're singing and why they're changing their song every year. And that's also one thing that I really find so fascinating about this field and why I'm still in it, because you're making discoveries, really basic discoveries, every day, pretty much. So
that's fantastic. And listen, so if you were to pick from the data that you analyzed so far, one, why highlight, or one most surprising things that you find out, what would that be?
Well, for me personally, I'm very interested in minke whale sounds, and so I've studied those whales for my PhD. I was working in the US at the time, and when I came to Scotland about 7 years ago now, people typically said to me, "Yeah, we've got lots of minke whales around here, but they don't really vocalize here. We don't record them." And I was saying, I couldn't imagine that to be true, because I've heard them so much on the other side of the Atlantic.
Okay.
So I couldn't believe they'd be quiet and silent on the west coast of Scotland. And so one thing the Compass Array helped us show is that we do record them, but we don't record them everywhere. So it seems like the sounds that we typically connect with minke whales, they're these low frequency pulse trains. They sound, again, I'll send you some examples later on.
Oh, please, yeah,
they sound very mechanical.
Uh-huh.
If you listen to them, they sound almost like a boat, as I think is the first reaction of most people. And so what we're still analyzing the data. Our PhD student, Tim Aubrey, is going to look into it, the whole Compass Array and the different years in more detail. But what we can already say is that we mostly detect them on the outer edges of our arrays. So these pulse trains seem to be produced in, on the outside of the outer Hebrides, or on the, in the deeper waters, not in the inshore waters. And so that was really fascinating to see. And that's the reason why they weren't recorded so much before, because although the whales are seen inshore, they're not producing that type of call in inshore waters. So that was really fascinating. And that's something we're still uncovering.
But for sure, we're gonna link in the show notes. We're gonna link your ResearchGate profile. There's a lot of papers, and I'm probably guilty of that. I'm just queuing those papers to read, and I have like a super long queue of papers I want to read, and occasionally I take in one from the bottom. It's like, no, this one sounds interesting. So we're gonna link that for people who want to get more detail on that. They can dive deep on it. Denise, tell me, from like overall the situation of marine mammals, how is it globally, or maybe locally, in whichever you feel more comfortable speaking, because you work in various places around the world. We hear all those terrible news about almost everything is in decline. How the marine mammals faring? Are they fairly well in comparison to, for example, sharks, which are like 80% hammered, or are there still, or this same story? How their conservation status as a group, as a taxa, I guess is the word, look like?
That's a very big question, and not that easy to answer, because it I have to start with saying it depends, and it really depends on which species you look at and which population. I think overall, when we think about the large whales, so the large baleen whales, including humpback whales, blue whales, fin whales, also minke whales, and so on, they obviously have been hunted for a long time in the Southern Ocean by the Japanese and others, and also in closer to us. There's still minke whales are still being hunted in Norway. There's been whaling in Iceland as well, and before that also in Scottish waters. So populations really took a hit during those whaling days, and most populations are still not back to what they were, or I can probably say all of them are not back to the sizes that they were before whaling. So they're all still in recovery. Some species are recovering faster than others.
Is the whaling still a factor in the decline? Is it like, because it obviously, whatever whaling is going on at the moment is a fraction of what it used to be. So is it still an impact, or is it like so small that it's not that much of an impact?
It again depends on where you look, and what the different population sizes are. So there are some populations around Japan, some minke whale populations there that are still declining, and whaling is a big factor in that. And there's this in other regions, whaling is part of a larger array of impacts. But we've got other impacts like entanglement in fishing gear is a big one for a lot of the big whale species, including in our waters. It's probably one of the biggest things we need to tackle is entanglement and ropes of fishing gear for these species.
Is that true that krill fishery is the worst when it comes to entanglements of whales? Did you hear that?
For these species in our waters, on the krill fishery is the main problem. Yeah, it's the krill, so it's the lobster pots. So it's these pots that are put out in big lines, and the problem there is that because they're like little cages that are all linked together by line, and then at the end there's a surface line to the buoy and to pick them back up. And there's kind of loops of line in between each of those cages. And so the whales swim through that and then get entangled in the rope. And sometimes there's more rope than there needs to be in the water column, and so they get entangled in that. So that's typically what happens. And that's a particular problem also on the in the western North Atlantic, on the east coast of the US. We've got the North Atlantic right whales. We had right whales also in our waters, but they were completely whaling basically.
I saw that, like an old picture
took them out completely.
Of a right whale in Ireland on the shore, and there was like a whaling going on, and we hammered all of them. That's sad.
Yeah. So sadly, we don't have them anymore on our side of the Atlantic. They are still hanging on on the east coast of the US and Canada, but there's a very small population, around less than 400 animals now, and there's a lot of effort that both the Americans and the Canadians are putting into trying to protect these animals, but entanglement is one of the biggest issues for these whales. The lobster fishery in the US where whales are getting really badly entangled. The problem also is that it's not just it's a welfare issue, because these whales are strong enough that they can pull all the gear with them. So often they get entangled, and then they basically get rolled up in the gear, and it's sort of over time just slowly gets into their skin and cuts them through. They're basically being sliced alive. Sorry to be so graphic, but it's a very serious problem which is extremely problematic from a welfare perspective, because these whales are really, really suffering, often over many years, before they eventually die out of exhaustion and sickness and so on. So that's one problem we really need to do something about and really
Are
need
there
to
known
tackle.
ways to prevent that? Is it like, like you said, like put a less rope in the water, or like use different rope, or use some sort of a devices that will scare them off? Do we have working ways to prevent that, or is it still we don't really know what to do?
There's things we can do. So we can. There's a lot of work that is going into trying to develop new ropeless fishing gears. So kind of like I described how we get our buoys back through acoustic release systems, so that we are playing a sound and then retrieve the gear. Obviously, the systems that we've been using are quite expensive and would be too expensive to roll out on a large scale in the fishing industry. But there's gone a lot of effort into developing cheaper devices that could be rolled out on a larger scale. So that's one thing. Closure areas at certain times of year, when we know the whales are in a certain area, is probably the most effective way of dealing with the problem, is to try and spatially separate the gear and the whales. And that's why it's so important that we need to know where the whales are when. That also is true for the second big problem that they're facing. And not just white whales, other big species face the same problem, is collision risk. So, big ships can collide with whales. The big tankers don't even notice if they hit even a large whale. Yeah, so that's the other, next to the pressure from entanglement, for large whales, collisions with ships is a big problem. And in case of the North Atlantic white whale, that's the second biggest cause of mortality in these whales, and that's why the population is not recovering, but in decline again at the moment. So those two big factors are a problem for that population, which is very threatened, but also for a lot of other species. Even if their population sizes might be bigger. So humpback whales that are doing overall well in the North Atlantic, at least the Caribbean population is, they still have to face the same problems. And then, of course, also underwater noise pollution, the kind of things we've talked about before, are an issue, not just for those large baleen whales, but also for different species of dolphins, the beaked whales, as we mentioned in the beginning, and so on. So all species of whales and dolphins use sounds throughout their lives, and so underwater noise has an impact on all of them. So different stressors. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you see future playing out for marine mammals? With everything that's going on, with the climate change, with all that, do you feel like we're moving in the right direction to protect them, or do you think that whatever we do is still way not
We
sufficient?
need to do more, like everywhere. We need to do more, and that particularly relates to tackling climate change, of course, because that will change, and we already see these changes and the distribution of prey for different species, which will shift them, and some of these shifts can already be seen. So species moving into new habitats, and then creating competition for species that are naturally occurring there. For example, we don't know exactly yet how it will all play out, but we know that there's big changes happening, and if your prey is moving away, that obviously is a big issue for you, and you'll have to follow, and not all species might be able to follow. That also impacts how they are impacted by us, and which, because we might push them into regions where human impact is bigger than in the habitat that they were living in before. So though it gets very complex very quickly, overall, there's everywhere, basically, we can do better. Haven't even mentioned plastic pollution yet. Marine plastics, marine litter, obviously, is a big issue, and that obviously through the food chain, marine mammals being on top of the food chain, they are also impacted by marine pollution. So there's a lot we need to do. We're trying our best. We're on the way, but yeah, definitely a lot more to be done in order to protect the species.
Yeah. But overall, are you optimistic that we're gonna kind of like ramp up our efforts in the right direction, or is it just one of those scientists who are just desperate while looking at the
Depends on
news?
the day you ask me. Of course, there's times of despair for me, as I think for a lot of my colleagues and probably all of your listeners out there as well. But I don't think that's very productive. So I'm trying to keep positive and try my best to play a small part in helping to make the world better for those species we study and ourselves. But yeah,
that's not a small part, Denise. Listen, thank you very much for your time. It's been tremendously educational, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you.